I'd like to welcome you to today's session, which is co-sponsored with the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center. Yes, please do turn off your cellular devices. That would be appreciated. It's a great pleasure to welcome John Ikenberry back to the Wilson Center. He was a fellow here in the 1990s. He wrote an important book here, or finished an important book while he was a fellow in residence after Victory, which is now kind of a modern classic in the field, and he's followed that with another major work, Liberal Leviathan, The Origins, Crisis, and Transformation of the American World Order, copies of which are available for purchase, and author inscriptions at the conclusion of today's session. John is the Albert Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. The bios have been distributed, so I won't go through the entire lengthy and distinguished bios of our two speakers, but John is currently in the Woodrow Wilson School and in the Department of Politics. He previously taught at Georgetown. He's held posts at the State Department and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As I mentioned, his books are now kind of required readings on not coerced readings, but required readings on curricula throughout American academia, and his writings have become the focal point of debate on really the big picture questions in international relations, where the international system is going, and has been used sort of as reference points, as sort of a structure of analysis, and many other scholars have kind of worked within. So his writings have been extremely kind of influential. And of course, because international relations is not like the laws of thermodynamics, where reasonable people can disagree on things, it's engendered lively debate as well. And we'll kind of engage in that today a bit. And in that regard, we're fortunate to have with us another former Wilson Fellow. This is Recidivist Day at the Wilson Center. Jim Goldgeier, who's currently the Dean of the School of International Service at American University, prior to taking on this administrative post at American. He was a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He's taught at Cornell, he's been at the Wilson Center fellow, other distinguished fellowships, served on the National Security Council staff. His most recent book is America Between the Wars, from 11/9 to 9/11, that he co-authored with Derek Shalit, and that was another book that was in part written at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The center, I think, one of our kind of the niches that we've tried to kind of fill here in Washington is to take important books from academia and to look at ideas in American foreign policy, and today's meeting is part of a series we've had over many years, including when John was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, to take kind of important books that engage in the role of ideas in the formulation of American foreign policy. So it's an excellent turnout today in early January, before universities have picked up, and I think it's a tribute to the interest in the topic and to the quality of the speakers today. So with that, let me turn the floor over to John Ikenberry.
Thank you, Rob. It's great to be here and great to be back at the Wilson Center, which was a wonderful year for me some years back when I was able to finish an earlier book, and met colleagues then who I stay in touch with, and have come to appreciate this place as a focal point in Washington for bringing together academic and policy ideas, and the kind of roads meet here between the academy and the policy world, and that's very exciting. It's great to be back here. Thanks to Jim, an old friend, for coming here to harass me, which I will look forward to. But first, before he does, let me just say a few words about the book, talk for 15 or 20 minutes. It is a book that I've been working on for some years, and taking earlier ideas from earlier works and trying to bring them to bear on how we think about world order and the American impact on the world. And just to wave the book at the beginning, you can see here it is. It's got a painting on it, an image of a painting by the American Impressionist painter Childe Hassam, who was painted in the 1920s and painted in one phase of his career flags. And this is on Fifth Avenue during a rainy day. This painting is in the Princeton University art collection, But I came to find out that the sister painting to this one that's very similar to this one, is in the White House collection. And in fact, it's hanging in the Oval Office right next to Barack Obama. So my idea is that someday when he's in a bookstore, he sees this book. This is, wow, that looks very familiar. So maybe he'll pick it up and read it. That painting was in JFK's bedroom. I'll pause. It was in Reagan's kitchen, and President Clinton also had it in the Oval Office. So it's been around the White House quite a bit. This book is trying to look at U.S. power in the 20th century and 21st century, and think about the way the U.S. has used its power to build world order. And I'm really looking at both ends of a kind of historical arc, the beginning and what we might say today is a transition, and I'll say a little bit about both. The first question is at the beginning, really in the mid-20th century, the question of how did the U.S. do it? What did it do? What kind of order did it create? The U.S. had more opportunities to create international order than any other state in world history, really. At least 3 times in the 20th century, the most important one being at mid-century, but after the Cold War as well. And even today, it's really hard to imagine that there's a state lurking that has more assets and opportunities to shape what happens over the next cycle of history than the United States does. But in the past, it was even more emphatically in command of the history of world order and able to shape it. So my question really is, in this book, how did it do it? What did it do? How did it connect power with purpose? What was its vision? How did what the U.S. did in creating order differ from past efforts by great powers? So I see this as something that can be put alongside other experiments, other efforts at order building. Was it an empire? And during some phase of writing this book, that was the question. We are now kind of debating the end of the American era or after unipolarity, but it was only a few years ago when we were debating, as my book wrestles with, what does a one superpower world look like, and what is the logic of cooperation and restraint to the extent it exists in such a world? So those are the questions really I'm asking about the creation of order during the American century, and I give a very positive account, really, of the American experiment. And it's a kind of book in that sense of the American accomplishment. What did the United States do? I suggest that it was an unusual effort. The U.S. built order. It built what I call liberal order. It was open and loosely rule-based, and it's generated massive returns in many, many ways: physical security, wealth creation, and so forth. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But the book is also about the future and about the transition we're in. I think most people would agree that we are at some kind of ongoing, probably long in the making kind of transition from an old order to something new. The world will, I think, even those of us who are very bullish on America, the world will become less American in the next generation. And so the question there is really, to the extent, and when the world becomes less American, will it become less liberal? Will it become less like the kind of system that the U.S. championed during those decades? Power is shifting. It's moving from north to south, from west to east. The rise of China, of course, is the most dramatic aspect of this transition. So the nature of power transitions and how that impacts on orders, and in particular on liberal order. And again, I give a very optimistic assessment of what we're seeing. I'm arguing really, and this is the punchline of the book, that there is a crisis of order today, a crisis of the American order, but it's not a crisis of liberal internationalism or the deeper logic of order. So it's a crisis of the American position within the system, but not necessarily, and I would argue, as I will today, the underlying logic and support structure for open rule-based order, what I call liberal order. Liberal internationalism is alive and well, I argue, and in making that argument, I'm engaging those who see the end of the American dominant position as an end to liberal internationalism or liberal order more generally. I'm arguing that there is a growing constituency really for open rule-based order, for the kind of solutions the U.S. brought to the problem of order during the 20th century. So the book is trying to do a number of things. It's kind of multitasking. It's trying at the intellectual scholarly level, I'm trying to put down the kind of what I'll call the intellectual architecture of thinking about international order. And I mean that in two ways. What this book tries to do and what my earlier work has tried to do, and what in some ways has been my career pursuit has been to think about how power and the rule of law interact, and the way in which powerful states and rules and institutions relate to each other. And I've been making the argument, and I do in this book, at as deep a theoretical level as I can, why powerful states in certain circumstances actually are champions of the rule of law, that law and power are not enemies but can be useful tools. In fact, the history of rules, not just in international relations but inside of societies in the West and beyond, has been really a story of stakeholders and power wielders using the rule of law to protect their assets and their equities. And so it's not an idealist kind of project. It's very much tied to establishing predictable environments and preserving power over the long term, however ironic and paradoxical that may sound. The other aspect of laying the intellectual architecture for thinking about international order is in kind of unearthing we'll call almost the geological strata of international order. One thing I've always been frustrated by in looking at popular books, whether Neil Ferguson or my old friend Bob Kagan or others are talking about the changing nature of the international order, power and order, is that there's so many different levels to the system. And so identifying what those might be, and so I have a kind of unearthing of those different logics and levels. The Westphalian order is really order based on sovereignty and the state system. That still is there, but on top of that, there have been repeated efforts over the last 200 years of the liberal ascendancy. There have been efforts to build on that Westphalian system, this kind of liberal project of rules and openness, cooperative security, multilateralism, and so forth, which I'll talk about in more detail about the American instance of that in a moment. So what I hope I'm doing in the book is helping us look at what these different levels are, and that then allows us to say what is in crisis and what isn't. The American authority position has to be renegotiated, but the deeper level, even the liberal level, and of course the deeper level of states and sovereignty are very much in place with practices and institutions and arrangements and settled practices that allow us to see continuity over the longer term. The second big thing I try to do in this book is provide a grand narrative. We're not all, in all of our pursuits, trying to do the academic work of specifying and testing theory. We're also, in some sense, competing in the public arena for grand narratives of where we're going. This is really what really guides the public discourse about America and the future. And it seeps into political campaigns and into foreign policy agendas and so forth. And what is the status of America in the world, and what are the accomplishments, and what has the U.S. done, and what are the problems that are generated as the American position changes? I'm very much trying in this book to paint a picture over many decades, even centuries, about the liberal ascendancy and the American moment within it, and what we can see has happened, and what we can see as the legacies of that order. So the grand narratives. And then finally, I'm trying to, and not simply because I spent a year at the Wilson Center and I was at policy planning for a year and so forth, but I'm trying to speak to policymakers and to in particular American grand strategy. And I'm really suggesting in the face really of these great changes, the rise of the non-West, the increasing interdependence of the world, security interdependence, economic interdependence, the new problems of order, that there are lessons and frameworks and accomplishments and assets that are there that we've invested in, we being America, we being the world of advanced democracies, we being the larger world community, that we should preserve and build upon. And I call that strategy of building on the frameworks of cooperation to meet these rising challenges, liberal grand strategy. So I'm trying to elevate, to make a kind of aside, in the debates among experts about grand strategy, the dominant thinking comes from realist scholars, Mearsheimer and Kagan, and to some extent neoconservatives who have their own big picture. I'm trying to elevate liberal ideas about democracy and institutions and cooperative security and so forth that have often not been put at the same level in the public discourse with the grand strategists who walk into the room with boots and who have Bismarck and the great power stories behind them. Liberals are talking about WTO and the UN, and they look like they're softies who should be in a different room. I'm saying we're coming into that room, and we have theory and history on our side in many ways in arguing about how great powers, and certainly the United States, has and should act in the world. And so that is my policy advocacy part of the book. So just to kind of spend a little time on really the past and then the future. The past, just simply to say that I tried in this book, particularly in a middle chapter, a very long chapter, to render an account of the American order, the world order that the U.S. built after World War II. The U.S. had this extraordinary opportunity. The old order had collapsed. Several of the leading, not just rival great powers, but rival ideas about order collapsed with Germany and Imperial Japan. You still had the Soviet Union, but the U.S. had built this system in the wake of that collapse. And I argue that this is an extraordinary moment, much more sophisticated, extensive order building than ever seen before in world history. Between 45 and 51, more international institutions were built, global, regional, economic, political, security institutions, big institutions, the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, the GATT, NATO, and of course the alliance system in Asia. And they were built around ideas that were not in the form that they had been in earlier centuries. Ideas about open trade, multilateralism, cooperative security, alliances, democratic solidarity, progressive ideals, and U.S. hegemonic order and power and leadership. And that part is, in my rendering, almost accidental. The U.S. after World War II wanted to build an order that would almost kind of operate automatically, very much like Woodrow Wilson, whose name is on this building, and whose name's on the building I work at in Princeton, really did want to change the world, but didn't want America to rule the world or run the world. It was to be a kind of self-going concern. And the rise of what we'll call the hegemonic formation of liberalism, in my argument, is somewhat of making a virtue out of necessity, of the U.S. standing in. So the UN did not play the security role, but NATO did. Bretton Woods did not play the economic role. The dollar did. The U.S. economy got fused to the world economy. The dollar became the world's key currency. And the security system branched out and became a kind of support structure for trade and the building of a variety of different kind of alliance and political partnerships and client-state relations. And so the liberal project at mid-century became a hegemonic project, and the U.S. played a stronger role. And I suggest that this was a distinctive kind of order, that it wasn't an empire, and there I kind of push back on the U.S. is an imperial state, although the U.S. has behaved imperially and quite crudely in Latin America and the Middle East. I can tell stories of the dark side of American power as long and in as much detail as anybody, but I'm suggesting that apart from that, there was this more enlightened project that spread out and has had this stabilizing and what I would say, generally speaking, positive role in the world. And I try to kind of become a little edgy in the book by suggesting that we can actually talk about different kinds of order in history, and we can't measure their accomplishment, but we can say this has been more successful than that. The order that Wilson wanted to create after World War I clearly wasn't successful. This one was more successful, defined in terms of durability and institutional form and global scope, and so forth. And if you go into the 19th century, you can talk about the British system, and of course you can talk about smaller international orders in previous centuries and in various regions of the world, and talk about them as in comparative terms. We don't do enough of that, and part of what I'm doing in my academic world is to try to develop the language and concepts to do that so we can compare international orders across time and space. And I suggest that there's something very interesting about this one. The U.S.-led order did a lot of work. It did a lot of work, and I list them really. It opened up the world economy and ushered in a kind of golden age of trade and growth after World War II through the building of these institutions of trade liberalization. Germany and Japan flipped from being enemies to being friends. Extraordinary story that we'd almost take for granted now, that these two countries only in a few years became junior partners in a global economy where each was a regional powerhouse, really, in opening and building the world economy. Germany and France found a way to find security in their relationship without balancing or going to war against each other, as they had done for all those decades, binding themselves together. And in my earlier book on After Victory, I talk a lot about the logic of security binding as a 20th century innovation that was a quiet revolution in world politics. And that story is very much about the story of the building of the American world order. Developing countries were brought into the system. Since the 1980s, there has been a kind of lifting up of countries as they've made transitions to market economy and transitions to democracy. There's been a kind of integration of the system. Korea, Taiwan, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Eastern Europe, all are stories of countries that have joined into this kind of ink spot that has grown through the liberal ascendancy and the spread of and integration and consolidation of this order after the Cold War and so forth. The Cold War ended peacefully and in favorable terms for the United States. So there's a lot here to say that there is a kind of liberal accomplishment. Then I go on and try to talk about what comes next. And here, the shadow of the rise of China and the future of this liberal order is really what is central. There's a big debate about this, about the character of change. Everybody is agreeing that the deep material capabilities of states, the distribution of capabilities is evolving. As I said, the West is shrinking relative to the rest of the world. The non-West is rising in various ways. The National Intelligence Council has called this a return to multipolarity. So the question I ask, and I think the question that many of us are asking, Professor Etzioni and I have had some discussion of this, and I hope to have some more, about China as it greets the liberal order. What are the features of that order? How is China and other non-Western states interacting with it? And I am making an argument, and it's really at the very end of this book, through the chapters, that I finally come to a kind of framing of my argument about how the non-West and this liberal order interact, and I am really making the argument that this order is both has been the generator of the success and rise of these states, and will be the framework in which they will continue to rise and assert their authority. To put it as simply as I can, the pathway to the high table of world politics continues to pass through and build upon the rules and institutions that have been established over the last 50 years. That the rising states, including China, do not have a vision of an alternative world order, but are seeking to rise up and work within this order. And at the very end of the book, I try to make arguments about why that is, why rising states have had a kind of stakeholder impulse. And as I've suggested, the crisis of the old order, where rising states that were not present at the creation and intensification of economic interdependence, security interdependence, are creating new demands for order building. I'm suggesting that the solution set for the demands continue to be the solution set that we've had over the last 50, 60 years. That is to say, we will find solutions to these problems through building on a logic of order that's organized around openness and the rule of law. There is a growing constituency for this in India, Brazil, the logic that we saw in Japan rising up. Often it's a kind of political economy logic in the first instance of economic elites who are becoming increasingly international and who see that their own livelihood is tied to a stable, open, loosely rule-based international order that will allow those rules to protect their growing assets and their growing internationally configured assets. That's what happened with Japan. And just a little side note, one year I spent a sabbatical in Japan at Keidanran, their international business organization. This was back in the 1990s. And this is when I first had my own kind of sense of how in this case, a Japanese business elite was increasingly seeing that they had stakes and a kind of interest, certainly, in a WTO-type world, in a OECD-type world, and increasingly they rose up and became a partner in that system. And I think that's clearly happening with India and Brazil. China is tough because of the nature of the state-market relationship. It's not as nice and not as clean, and it's harder to tell a liberal story. That's absolutely true. But my argument really there at the level of the China and the world economy is that China can continue to be a spoiler, to be a kind of predatory agent in an open world system, but they can't use their model as a model of the international order, because that if everybody follows that model, it all breaks down. We call it protectionism, and the system collapses. So there is room for opportunistic predatory behavior at the edges, but it's not a model such that in the previous eras, such as Britain in the 19th century, the U.S. in the 20th century, the model of political economy got externalized and became the framework for rules and institutions internationally. That's not going to happen. There's a contradiction there. And beyond that, they have at least one foot in this open system already. The second argument about why I expect more of a, if you will, a non-event in the 21st century, the rise of China as it clashes with the old system, is that this old system is much more deeply entrenched institutionally and in terms of its global scope than any other, as I've said before, order in world history. China has the bad luck to be rising up and meeting a very, very unusual and deeply entrenched international order. It's an order that I've argued is easy to join and hard to overturn, that is deeply rooted in the economies and societies of an expanding number of countries. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. And it's going to be, you aren't going to be able to replicate an American order building moment such as the U.S. had in mid-20th century. Thirdly, I don't think China has first order ideas that are different from those inside the existing system. And I debate with many of my good experts, friends on this issue of what is the Chinese agenda, but I don't see the new ideas. The ideas are ideas that there's a politics going on about, in some cases, China wanting more of a sovereignty-based system, and liberal states wanting more shared sovereignty. There is a debate about that, but China is using the ideas and practices and institutions in the existing order to advance its interests, bringing it further into that order. In this case, championing Westphalian ideas through the UN Security Council, which is a quintessential Westphalian institution. They are stepping further into the existing order, layered as it is with Westphalian and liberal ideas on top of each other like a layer cake. But they are inside the system using assets and ideas in it to advance their interests. They are not on the outside saying, we want a different system. They are on the inside using ideas which are, as an aggregate, not always consistent. Sovereignty and interventionism are inconsistent at some level, but so are in democracies norms of equality and liberty. We in our societies, on a daily basis, we struggle inside of liberal democracies with inconsistent ideals. Some want more of this, some want more of that, and there's a politics. That's what's going on in the world. And China is increasingly in that world of normal politics about debate about norms. So I'm taking that argument as strong as I can in that direction. Then finally, when we talk about the future of international order, at some level you can't talk about its future without talking about what are the problems that are going to be 21st century problems that order will need to respond to. And here I've talked about the rising states and the struggle for authority, which is ongoing, but not a struggle for basic ideas. It's a struggle for the distribution of authority, but not ideas. But I also, and really in the book with this focus on rising economic and security interdependence, that it's hard to imagine the world in the middle of the 21st century that is going to be less interdependent, where problems of getting our economies synchronized, coordinating our macroeconomies, our trade and investment, and then even more profoundly, our security environment, where it's almost impossible to imagine a 21st century where we can protect ourselves physically at the borders. That is to say, security interdependence. Security interdependence is a term of art for defining the degree to which our security depends on what other people do elsewhere. And if you're behind two oceans and you're not going to be hit by anything, regardless of what other countries try to throw at you, you're security independent. The vision of a shield, a global shield, or a shield around missile defense around the United States, that kind of Reagan vision of almost a kind of a dome over North America where missiles can't get in. That's trying to solve the security problem by achieving greater security independence. But if that's not possible in an age of technology that allows the proliferation and the spread of biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons of mass destruction, let alone environmental degradation, health epidemics that pass across borders, the only way we can be secure is by working together in new and complex ways. Or to put this on a bumper sticker that I hope President Obama would add to his speeches, you can't be secure, in today's world, you can't be secure alone, you can only be secure together. And that is the fundamental idea behind the liberal project, both in the long term as it's been wielded by many different types of states, and in the mid-20th century up to today by the United States, that you have to build collective institutions. And that, to me, means that alternative ideas, whether they come from China, whether they come from elsewhere, are not going to be able to meet the test of functionality and problem-solving capacity. That orders in the end rise and fall not just because of power, although that's true too. They also rise and fall on whether they respond to the needs of governments. And I'll just end on one little anecdote. In one of my classes, I was making this argument about the functionality of international order. It's a very dry, abstract argument. My students were kind of rolling their eyes. And I was saying that, the international order depends on three things: on power, legitimacy, that is to say the ideas resonate with the nature of the domestic systems. And I've been trotting out this idea of functionality, that international orders have to solve problems. So I had in the back of my head, China, if they're going to have an international order on tap that they're going to try to sell the world as a post-American international order, it's not just going to have to be backed by power and ideas, it's going to have to be backed by functionality. It's going to have to actually do things that other countries will want done. And so I was making this functionality argument, and one of my students raised his hand and said, well, have you ever seen the movie The Life of Brian? And there's a scene in there about the Jewish resistance in Rome and Judea, and the leader of the resistance said, "What have the Romans ever done for us?" And then one sheepish disciple puts his hand up and said, "Well, aqueducts." Then somebody said roads and running water, and somebody put up wine, and the leader says, "Well, yes, of course, but aside from aqueducts and roads and wine," and then some public health, and then order said, "I don't think it would be quite as safe if they left," and well, that's true too, and then on, and then he said, but besides that, what have they done? And he clearly is on the defensive at that point, and the point was well taken. So it seems to me that the battle for who's going to be at the center of future world order will depend not just on power and the ideas, although both will be important, but on what kind of order solves problems that we care about. And that leads me back to, I think, both the accomplishment of the liberal era and the ideas that I think continue, wielded by a different coalition of states, to be sure, that I hope and think will still be viable in the 21st century. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, John. Jim?
Wow.
Okay. Yes, indeed.
Well, great. So, of course, it's a great honor to be back here at the Wilson Center, and particularly to have been asked to comment on another brilliant book by John Ikenberry. And it's a book that shows off all of John's outstanding qualities, his breadth of knowledge, which is extraordinary, his theoretical sophistication, his beautiful writing skills, and his optimism, which I think is very important in this book. There are a lot of arguments today, of course, about how the United States is losing its position in world affairs. And so it's actually quite refreshing to read a book that makes the case that the liberal order of the United States helped create and has led since World War II can continue to evolve under American leadership. John's case is twofold. First of all, as you've heard, he argues that there aren't any clear alternatives to the liberal order that would be superior for advancing the interests of the major states. And second, which he didn't emphasize as much in this talk, that the United States, is still the most powerful state militarily and the leading political and economic power, and even in the face of rising powers can reclaim legitimacy and advance its interests through this order. John does understand that this is not easy. He spends some amount of time looking at what the United States squandered during the Bush years when it sought to place itself above the rules of the liberal order. And while he doesn't dwell too much in the book on American internal problems, I think that, we can all recognize political dysfunctionality and economic distress that may, in fact, have long-term consequences. Now, as I said, John is optimistic. He writes, quote, "If America is smart and plays its foreign policy cards right, 20 years from now it can still be at the center of a one-world system defined in terms of open markets, democratic community, cooperative security, and rule-based order." But as you go through the book, it's clear that, of course, he understands that even if this turns out to be the case, this system will become flatter, is the term that he uses, more universal, less Western. It's not going to be the United States in charge. It's going to be the United States helping ensure that the liberal order continues to operate even in the absence of American hegemony. And what I want to do in my remarks is actually to focus on something that's not in the book that I think is, in my view, a major challenge to the implementation of the strategic vision that John lays out. And in fact, I think that the focus on the problems that were created by the first term of the George W. Bush administration with respect to legitimacy and governance, this is an important part of the book. But I think it does actually detract our attention away from a thread that runs from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama's administration that helps us understand, again, what I think is a serious challenge as the United States tries to develop policy, especially if it were to go in the direction that John suggests over the next 10 to 20 years. So what is that thread? Both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama have understood that the United States would have to be a different kind of leader as other countries emerged in world politics. But the challenge they faced is how to express that without creating an adverse political reaction. Bill Clinton really chose, for the most part, not to express these views while he was in office. But in 2006, he told his close foreign policy friend and former Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbott the following, quote, "When I became president, everybody thought we were the biggest dog in the hunt. But America had significant domestic problems. These social, budgetary, and economic problems would constrain our ability to act alone internationally. I was always obsessed with the notion that sooner or later, since I believe intelligence and ability are evenly distributed throughout the world, but opportunity and organization aren't, as the global economy continued to expand, eventually America would no longer be the sole economic, political, and military superpower. So I wanted to build a world for our grandchildren to live in where America was no longer the sole superpower for a time when we would have to share the stage." Now, he said that in 2006. He didn't say that a lot while he was in office. In fact, I don't think he did a lot to prepare Americans for this eventuality. He prepared for the opposite. He spent the 1990s emphasizing the need for the United States to lead world affairs as the indispensable nation. That's a term he first used in 1996 at the Democratic National Convention and was later associated most closely with Madeleine Albright, but it was Bill Clinton who used it first. And it was designed primarily for the domestic audience. Great concern that Bill Clinton had was that Americans would want to retreat from world affairs. He wanted to keep the United States engaged in world affairs. And to try to make this case, the United States was indispensable in helping to solve world problems, that problems could not be solved if the United States was not leading. Of course, the audience that heard it was the international audience, which didn't like the term indispensable nation, but that's another story. But I think that Clinton's not talking about what the rise of others would mean for American strategy and instead really talking about America's role at the top of the system continued to feed a notion that the United States would develop solutions that others would have no choice but to follow, and that they would do so because the United States had proven that its political and economic system was the best. That was the lesson drawn from the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. And I think you see this similar dilemma when you look at these first 3 years of Barack Obama's term in office. When you look at the way in which the President, the Secretary of State, and others have presented their views on world affairs, I think, in fact, you see a worldview that suggests that White House officials and State Department officials have certainly channeled their inner Ikenberry. The 2010 National Security Strategy says the following: power in an interconnected world is no longer a zero-sum game. Given the mutual interests of the major powers, and it's important to note the document does use the terms common or shared interest 10 times, and the word mutual appeared nearly 30 times. The main foreign policy objective is to create the institutions necessary to coordinate and solve policy problems. When Barack Obama talks about states refusing to accept the norms of the community and that those states will be isolated, he's referring to states like North Korea and Iran. The national security strategy does not contemplate that countries such as China and Brazil might have different conceptions of international order. And I think it fits very squarely within this notion that John has laid out, that there isn't really a good alternative for them, that that their place really should be in the international order that we have. Now, I think what's very striking about the arguments that are put forward by the Obama administration on foreign and national security policy that you see in documents like the National Security Strategy or the major speeches that the President and Secretary of State have given, I think you see very clearly two parts to a lot of those documents or speeches. The first is on how the United States has to get its domestic house in order, how it's constrained in terms of resources, how it really needs to address the problems at home to be effective as a leader in world affairs. And then there's usually the rest of the document, which is about all the things that the United States will do that isn't that different from the things the United States has done in the past. And a lot of the language is very similar to the language of the indispensable nation from the mid-1990s. And why is there that disconnect? I would argue because for the president to talk about how the United States as a leader is going to have to be fundamentally different going forward feeds the political response that he doesn't believe in American leadership. Look at Governor Romney's speech at the Citadel last fall. He said the following, quote, "This is America's moment. We should embrace the challenge, not shrink from it, not crawl into an isolationist shell, not wave the white flag of surrender, nor give in to those who assert America's time has passed. That is utter nonsense. An eloquently justified surrender of world leadership is still surrender. I will not surrender America's role in the world. This is very simple. If you do not want America to be the strongest nation on earth, I am not your president. You have that president today. The 21st century can and must be an American century." Now, talking about America as a different kind of leader, talking about the kinds of things John's talking about, is not saying you don't want America to be the strongest nation on earth, or you don't believe in American leadership. But it's very easy, once you start talking about a different conception of American leadership, for you to face this argument. You don't believe in American exceptionalism. You don't believe that the United States should be the leader of the free world, as Governor Romney talked about in the Citadel speech. A phrase, we haven't heard a lot, that phrase a lot since the end of the Cold War. And I think that this is that this really is a challenge. There's a political challenge for talking about the changing nature of leadership in the liberal order that I think we have to address. Now, one of the things that I find quite striking when you look across the board at academic strategists, and John quite rightly talked about raising up liberal notions of strategy alongside the more traditional realist notions, I think what's striking as you look across the board from liberal to realist today is the emphasis on bringing means and ends in closer alignment. Now, when you look at the strategists across the board, this is the one whose strategy involves the highest costs. But I think, in John's argument, the purpose of relying heavily on institutions is, in large part to lessen America's burden and to allow the institutions to do a lot of the heavy lifting in achieving America's liberal purposes. If you look at some of the other strategists out there on the realist or even further, on the realist end of the spectrum, in terms of aligning means and ends, you have somebody like Steve Van Evera at MIT talking about a concert in which the United States would serve as one of several major stakeholders, and the idea here is to spread the cost of managing commons issues even more by lessening America's need to lead a liberal order and basically focus on solving problems like climate, health, proliferation, terrorism, and so on through great power management. Then you go further to the offshore balancers and even to, what I think you could even talk about as the isolationists, for whom providing for America's security is relatively cheap. Allies can take care of themselves. and the United States can turn its attention to rebuilding the domestic order and particularly the country's infrastructure. So I think you have that, on the academic side, you have, from liberal to realist, you have this emphasis on trying to bring means and ends into closer alignment. I do think we have a president who does think a lot about this, how to bring the means and ends in closer alignment, and we saw this in practice with the Libya intervention. We had an intervention for humanitarian purposes, blessed by the international community, but led by the British and French through NATO, and it was a lot cheaper for the United States than the Kosovo intervention back in 1999. But let's remember, because it's hard to remember since it, at least the military part, ended well. It did seem for a while like it might not work. And there were a lot of people ready to lambaste the president. They even did during early parts of it. Ready to pounce on him for a lack of leadership if the mission failed. And I think the phrase leading from behind didn't help the cause. But even though I would argue that was a mission that can serve as a model for the kinds of things John's talking about in terms of American strategy, I do think that it's going to be difficult to have the kind of serious political conversation that's necessary to implement the ideas of this book without the charge, without getting this charge of abdicating America's traditional role. And to my mind, that is, in fact, the major impediment to putting in practice what is a very carefully crafted strategy, and I think, on the whole, one that would serve the United States and the world very well. So I wanted to raise that, but above all, John deserves congratulations for writing such an important book and for continuing, and I would say continuing, because this is not his first statement. I hope it's not his last statement in this regard, but he's really provided us with an extraordinarily deep understanding of the origins, the nature, and the possible future of the liberal order in his writings previously in this book, and as I said, I hope in his future books as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Open it up now for comments and questions. If speakers could please identify themselves, and there are microphones there. Tim, why don't we start with this gentleman here, and we'll work around the room. You on? Go ahead. It's on.
I think so. It's on.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Sang-Yun Ma. I'm currently a public policy scholar at the Geopolitical Center. My question is actually about the world without American leadership. You mentioned that the Americans will exercise less leadership, less hegemonic leadership in the world. And I'm wondering, that really means that the American leadership is not really here in the world, or the American leadership is exercised in a lesser level. I just want to listen to your answer to that. And second question related to the first one is, I'm wondering, without or with lesser level of American leadership, can liberal order will survive? So American policy in the previous decades took the role of caretaker of the liberal order, but without that without that caretaker, can liberal order really be survived? That is my question. Thank you.
That's a great question, and both of those really about leadership, and they overlap with Jim's question about how the sustainability of what would be a slightly diminished American position. And I do have, in the end of the book, have kind of several models of liberal order where there is kind of one where it's really the U.S. isn't first among equals. It really is a post-American liberal order. But I have another category that gets put in there that I continue to think about, which is where the U.S. continues to play a catalytic role. It is different, and I think for some years to come, the U.S. really, there is no easy substitute for U.S. leadership. So I'm wishing American leadership well, and I spent a lot of the time in the book lamenting moments when the U.S. has not played its cards correctly and has not fully understood the system that it's in and the kind of capstone role it has played in that system, that the other countries in Asia, certainly Europe and elsewhere, Middle East, have made strategic decisions about their security, about the way they orient themselves to the world, based on the fact that the U.S. is there providing what I call systemic or functional services to the order. And by the way, this is relevant to Jim's first point about domestic support for internationalism. Americans don't know that role either. There's kind of what I would call almost like internationalism on stilts in America. That is to say, you go to Iowa, which just had a whatever it was, and primary, and sorry? Circus, yes. And I'm from the Midwest, so I can joke about my brethren in the heartland, but there isn't really a consciousness of the kind of functional role the U.S. plays in the world. And so the support beams domestically for this role are not necessarily strong, even though when the U.S. rhetorically looks like it's backing away from the kind of chest beating of we are number one, we are the best, politicians take a hit from that. So it's a complicated domestic position that leaders are in, wanting to have a grand strategy that both maximizes American influence in the world, but doesn't extend America beyond its means. And so I'm, in some sense, repeating that basic problem. But your second question is, will liberal order survive without as strong an American position? And I'm suggesting yes. What has been kind of
I think you meant, John, if America provides global public goods and we are putting less money to do that, you see lines of communication, et cetera, can that, wither the liberal order right. under those circumstances? Right, and that's my answer is we are evolving in that direction already. It's more of a partnership-based system than we sometimes admit. That is to say, even during the heyday of the American century, partnerships and client states and the bilateral relationships the U.S. had, I make this argument in the book, were partly ways for the United States to make deals with countries like Germany and Japan who would support and partly underwrite the American leadership position. So the U.S. has not been paying for the global order on its own, even during the high tide of American leadership. So it's not as if we're going from white to black, from one idyllic kind of order where the U.S. pays all the public goods to another. I think we are evolving toward a more shared system, but we've had sharing all along. I advocate that we should renegotiate the bargains where we, in effect, this is the grand bargain with countries like China, Brazil, and India, is that we acknowledge their desire to share authority. The U.S. has had authority, rights, and privileges in this system. It's been a hierarchical liberal order. So what I'm saying in the book, some of that hierarchy is going to have to be renegotiated. The United States is going to have to cede some authority. The Europeans are going to have to cede some authority. Concretely, that means, for example, shares and positions in the IMF and the World Bank. Other countries are going to have to be shareholders, in very concrete terms. The redistribution of rights and authority. That, I can't, as a scholar looking at the great sweep of history, I can't see how we avoid that. And I don't think it's necessarily something that is that diminishes America's national interest, because you are the flip side of a slight devolution of leadership in the liberal order can be recoded as burden sharing. That actually is good. That's good speak in American politics. It's getting others to share the burden. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a politics of evolving this, but I want to say that I don't want the U.S. to sort of pull the plug and go home. I'm as much of a kind of
America not is indispensable, but America has a special role to play, and by geography and history and the incredible investments in these partnerships. Let me just make one example of that just brings it home for me, and it's in the latter part of this book. And if I were to write the book again, I'd put it in the first chapter. And it's really a list of a coding of the alliances the U.S. has, the coding of the alliances China has, and the coding of the alliances the Soviet Union / Russia has, all since 1945, on 5-year increments going forward. The U.S. starts in 1945, 49, that first 5-year period, with over a dozen security partners. And then every 5 years going forward, and after the Cold War, it continues to go to 64, what it has today. So it's 12, 14, 18, 16, 20, 35. And of course, after the Cold War, you have NATO partners who come in, so that increases a big chunk there. But the U.S. has 64 alliance partners today, coded as where there's an Article 5 commitment on going one direction or the other to protect the other. So India is not an alliance in this coding. China, on those 5-year increments, is 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1. So as the U.S. was going up to 64, China was static. And then the Soviet Union, Russia has something like 8 or 9. And then when it changes from the Soviet Union to Russia, it changes. The numbers don't change. It's just the countries change. Now it's their former republics become their allies, and their Eastern European former allies are now in the other category. But there's something weird about that. The U.S. has all these alliances, and China doesn't do alliances. And my question is, I can't see a transformation of the world. I can't see a China-centered world where the U.S. has 64 alliances and China has 1. So I don't think I'm trying to slow everybody down a little bit and say, this is not yet a moment where we bury the American leadership position. But smart policy means burden sharing. It's what I think Secretary Clinton's speech about we don't want a multipolar world, we want a multi-partner world. We do partnerships. That's something it's woven into the way the U.S. thinks about doing things in the world. It likes to sit down and do things with others. That should be built upon.
The gentleman here, and then please identify, and then Amitaya Tzioni, and then the gentleman in the back. We'll try to take a couple more questions, and then get you as well those 5 questions, because I want to save time for kind of the reception, and you'll have an opportunity to interact with the author, over drinks. So please go ahead.
Fabio Ruggio, University of Pavia, Italy, and fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I thank you very much. I followed your presentation, and I share your case. I think it's, as far as I can say, well-founded. Yet I have a doubt which becomes a question. If I understand your point, it's just not so much about how America should behave or what policy should follow, but it's about the fact that the world order can survive a diminished American leadership. And I think this is, you maintain this, you claim that this is possible because of 2 factors, I understand. First, elites and actors all over the world share an interest in keeping up this international order. Second, there is no other idea, there is no other suggestion for a new and different international order. You acknowledge that there can be predatory attitudes, so I understand local conflicts or things like this, but no comprehensive idea, and I understand values for a new order. Now, my doubt and my question is the following. Normally, orders in international arena or in the national arena are not replaced by new orders, but are replaced by disorder. That is, what I think is threatening or could be threatening, or the threat we should be looking at nowadays, trying to understand what is the future of this international order is how many predatory attitudes, how many local conflicts, how many initiatives without a concept, without an idea, without a value, can this international order survive?
Okay, thank you.
I think this is a point.
I'd like to collect a couple of questions and give our speakers an opportunity to. This gentleman, yeah, we'll take you on the side, and then Amitai, and we'll just work down, and the gentleman in the back, and then we'll close it with that. So go ahead, sir.
Yeah. My name is Heather Malik. I've conducted research here at the Woodrow Wilson Center on Fragile States. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown University. I just want to pull the string on American support for the liberal order just a little bit. Since we don't have the order of battle, in other words, the United States has not lost the veto in the Security Council. Yes, there's problems with the economy, but we're not broke yet. A time will come, 20, 30 years, when a lot of these goodies that we take for granted are going to go away. My only doubt is, will as the goodies go away for the United States, will the support for the liberal order go away, and it becomes a selective order, and the United States starts pulling out, becomes more fair. The liberal order becomes more fair for the world, but less fair for the United States. What will happen then?
And Amitai Etzioni. Amitai, right behind you, the microphone. Thank you.
I very much agree with Jim, and that it's truly an outstanding book. I got an early copy, so I both appreciate your penetrating analysis, and that you have a clear thesis and project it on the future. So my question is much more narrow, and that is what follows from what you say for our China policy, not what we say, but what we do. And so I love this concept of binding security. And the question is if balancing and containment are not a contradiction. I think you suggested. And so, for instance, if you go to Vietnam, Philippines, and Malaysia, and say to them, we don't want you to talk to China one-on-one. We want you to get together and push them back. Or we go and build up their navies, or try to get India to call India in order to counter, to balance. This project is 19th century idea on China. Sending the Marines to Australia, not to protect it from New Zealand, I assume. In effect, it would seem to me that what we would fit much more into your strategy is to say the one thing that's very important to China is secure access to resources. So instead of Robert Kaplan running around and getting all hot under the collar because they're going to get one port in Pakistan, we should build one for them, or at least we should have them. And if they feel like the Soviet Union, that we're surrounding them, we should have a little conversation about it. So never mind what we say, but Kissinger's co-evolution, or you're bridging security, I don't see we're doing that.
Thank you. And the gentleman in the back will give you the last question. I'm sorry we don't have time for more, and then we'll give our speakers a final opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay.
Doctor, it sounds like a very, very good book. I look forward to reading it. I guess I wanted to ask you about
Could you identify yourself, please?
This is Dan Gibbons at Georgetown. I guess my question has to do with your concept about the China's inability to integrate or to posit an alternative principle for leadership in the international order. I worry. I agree with you that they don't have one now, but as we have noted, China has said, well, we were quite disturbed because the United States, we thought they knew what they were doing in terms of economics. You see, so so these this architectural and normative. So that's my question vis-a-vis whether perhaps maybe the international order isn't perfect yet. Maybe there are evolutions necessary.
Thank you.
How much time should I?
Why don't we give Jim? You don't need any. Okay, take
His book.
Take what you need to
5 minutes or?
Yeah, 5 to 10. Yeah.
Okay, these are great questions, and
They sort of grouped, though,
they are.
and a couple.
And there's a question about American domestic support for leadership and support for liberal internationalism that I think I want to speak to. And it was Jim's second question, and it was also here in the first question and in, I think, the fourth question about when the goodies go away, that is to say U.S. Privileges, veto, for example, in the UN, will the U.S. support for internationalism go down? And I think there is a challenge here. So let me make 2 points. First, partly why the book is trying to emphasize the positive and put a rosy light, but not unrealistic light, I think. It's not trying to tell a fairy story, but fairy tale, but it is trying to speak to an American audience saying that the U.S. has experiences and practices and ideas that it's brought to bear on the global stage, and it's worked out pretty well. Don't walk away from it. So it's partly trying to inspire leaders who say, well, those international institutions, they're being now dominated by third worlders and the global south, and why are we in them now? I'm trying to suggest that there is something in it for us. In fact, we were in many ways the authors of those frameworks that are now bringing more states in. So this is not something to be scared about or to walk away from. So part of what I'm trying to do is to acknowledge there is a domestic problem and at the elite level and then perhaps at the domestic level, although there's popular public opinion polls that continue to show support for engagement, international institutions, the UN, U.S. leadership. They are not, the Pew studies are not showing a sharp decline. But our elites are often less, as the post-war generation goes and as the newer generations evolve and see other states that seem to be rising up, they forget perhaps some of the accomplishments and ideas and practices that we bundle together in this liberal project. So I'm trying to suggest it's a project worth pursuing yet again. I do think there is a problem, and I think Jim has put his finger on it. How do you give ground? How do you give up some of the privileges and rights that you've had, and yet be able to tell the American people we're still strong and there's still a good bargain for us in doing what we're doing? And I think we have to make the case, and I think I've written, not in the book, but elsewhere, and I have a new piece about trying to, and at the end of this book I talk about the need for a new public philosophy of internationalism. That when you go back and read and think about what people like Truman and Acheson were saying, they weren't always on the same page. Acheson was more of a realist. Truman was more of an idealist when it came to the UN, remarkably. But they worked together in various ways. And that kind of American synthesis of hard-headed realism, Acheson, who was not did not have a rosy-eyed view of the UN. He famously said, even while in office, in a speech that about the United Nations, he said, well, the United Nations, he quotes the Arab proverb, you take an ass to Mecca and it's still an ass. No matter where you take your diplomacy to the marble halls of the United Nations, your attitudes don't really change. You're still who you were before you got there. And so there's a kind of sober realism there, but it's infused with this Truman sense that we do need a global institution that brings us together and that at least creates a methodology for discussing our differences. So that fusing in the American tradition of, again, in the very beginning of the book, the Western movie that has been always my favorite movie, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. It has John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart a Princetonian, so he's represents the lawyer coming from the east to this Western town. John Wayne is this hard-boiled rancher who knows that in the end, if you're going to get those Lee Marvin and the other members of the gang out of town, you're going to have to show your gun to them, so to speak. But you aren't going to be able to rally the people unless you've got the rule of law, which is Jimmy Stewart. This is kind of combining of these two archetypes. That for half a century, that was a kind of an American public philosophy about internationalism that fueled a willingness to step forward and to think in enlightened ways. Not always, because we have intervened to overturn regimes, and we have played other characters on the global stage. But there is this type, and what I'm suggesting is we need to reinvent it for a new generation because of the problems that Jim and several others have mentioned. China, and Professor Etzioni is very kind in your comments, and also I think pointed in your concern, and I'm wrestling with these issues, and I hope to discuss with you. I have a little bit more of a positive view about how we're dealing with China, because ultimately I think, as my colleague Anne-Marie Slaughter in one of these debates about, well, what is American China policy? She said, well, it's a policy of enmeshment. And that's a good liberal idea. That's my security binding. That's trying to get China into our world. That is what I would describe as the deep strategy, that we want China to see that it has an interest in working with these institutions and rules and practices that we've been building and supporting for all these decades. And the story is they've really moved in that direction a great deal. So the question is, what about the containment? You know, we do have this kind of counterpoint policy where we had in 2010 we had Hillary go to the ASEAN Regional Forum and rally the ASEAN states and say, we've got your back. And I thought it was a brilliant policy, because it was telling China that they can't be a bully in this neighborhood. There's going to be it has to be a multilateral settlement of these territorial disputes and maritime disputes. And it does have the effect of signaling to China this, and of course strengthening the alliances as they have been strengthened, Japan and Korea, by virtue of what China has done. My argument is that what brings us back to a kind of constructive American position that, in a kind of dialectical way, creates the environment for China to step further into the order rather than away from the order, and this is where we disagree, is that it signals to China that there isn't a pathway to dominance in the region that won't entail the risk of backlash. That the reason why China needs to build relations with the West and work within these regional and global institutions is to signal restraint to its neighbors, which is good for China and good for the neighbors. The problem China faces is a strategic dilemma, which in earlier eras the diplomatic historians call self-encirclement. It's post-Bismarck Germany. Germany wanting to become a more powerful great state, and simply by wanting to become that and taking steps to advance itself militarily and to build up its power, it triggered a backlash that made it less secure. And China faces the same problem of self-encirclement. And what the U.S. has signaled to China and what the neighborhood has signaled to China is we want China to be more of what China wants to be, which is to say big, strong, growing, prosperous, but we want it in the context of agreed upon rules and institutions where we can live together. And China has to know that it can't take this other pathway to dominance. So it's constructive. To cite yet another colleague, Tom Christensen, very nicely has said that when the U.S. has sort of put its hands out and said, these are our red lines. We're going to push back if you go beyond this. It actually has the effect of making China know what kind of environment it's in and to incentivize it to cooperate more. And so I don't think we're talking about containment here. I think we're talking about prudent countermeasures and by the way, the U.S. can't contain China because the countries in the middle don't want the United States to. We're talking about Korea, we're talking about Japan, Taiwan we'll leave aside, ASEAN countries. These are countries that their chief trade partner is China. Their chief security partner is the United States. They look to the dragon for economics and the eagle for security. So they are tied to both countries. They don't want the United States to push too hard, but they want the United States to have their back. So there is a kind of equilibrating dynamic. China does not want self-encirclement, and the United States does not want to go on a crusade to contain China that its partners won't get in line and follow to the end. So there is a kind of restraint on both the side of China and the United States, but it involves prudent measures that signal resolve. And that's not inconsistent with a vision of a future China that is more heavily integrated, enmeshed, if you will, or in my term, security co-binding and political binding with its neighbors in the United States. So I'm holding to this, as Jim quoted me at the very beginning, that if the United States plays its cards right, we can live in a one-world system, not divided by Cold War, but one where the U.S. gives some ground, but in these bargains that are negotiated over and over again in the context of power transitions that never end, we can still adjust to each other and save the most virtuous and effective and functional aspects of the old order and bring them forward into the new one.
Thank you, John. We're going to close the session. There's a reception outside, book sales. We've been talking much about strategies. Let me mention your personal exit strategies for the evening from this session. If you're in Washington, always have an exit strategy. Our front door will be closed, but you have to go back into the mothership, the main Ronald Reagan building, and then there are kind of a variety of exits that you can go from there, but you have to walk past the plaza with the inscriptions of Woodrow Wilson and the Baskin sculpture there. Thank you very much for attending today. Please join me in thanking Jim and John for excellent presentations.